Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. I'm John Zorn, Executive Director of Arts Reach, and we're really lucky to have Anil Malhotra with us today. He's the President of Analytics. He's been doing this kind of work for a good 20 years now. I think he's got a lot of insights, and he's going to share them with us today. Just a couple of announcements before we get started. I want to just let everybody know that we're doing 3 conferences this summer. They're so popular that we added one this year. We'll be in Toronto at the end of June. We'll be in San Francisco at the end of July, and we'll be in New York at the beginning of August. So 3 chances to attend the National Arts Marketing Development and Ticketing Conference, where we'll be talking about these kinds of topics and many, many others. You can find out all of the info at artsreach.com. Our deadline for the super early bird rate is coming up. It's February 21, and if you register by then, you'll get the lowest price and a 3-for-1 offer. So you can buy 1 registration and bring 2 of your colleagues for free. Okay, I think what we're going to do is, before I turn it over to Anil, is we're going to take a really quick poll here, if I can get this going. And it's real simple, but we thought it would be a good way to start. So there you go. Have you ever tried your own in-house analysis for a house rezoning or a rescaling project? Give you another few seconds to chime in. Okay, so we've got our answer. It's 67% yes and 33% no. So about 2/3 of people on our webinar today have tried something on their own in-house. Okay, Anil, we're all good.
Great, thanks, John, and thanks for the opportunity. I appreciate it. I'm a big fan of the work that you've done over the years. So thank you for allowing me to kind of come and share some thoughts and ideas, some learning, some things that I've learned. Every one of the projects that we do, we learn something new from it. Just the 1-minute background on Analytics Live. We have been working with performing arts organizations for close to 20 years now, kind of broadly under the umbrella of revenue management. And that includes everything from rescaling and rezoning to pricing, both initial pricing, dynamic pricing, budgeting, sort of a range of topics, anything that touches, anything where data can be used to inform revenue related decisions. We kind of live in that world. And so what I wanted to walk through with you today are things that we've learned about house scaling, both ideas and concepts, as well as an actual kind of, let's get into the details a little bit on what this looks like when you do the analysis part of it. We'll pull some truths out of that, and hopefully some of this will land. I'm sure some of it will be relevant, some of it you might find not relevant, but hopefully that there's a little bit of all of that for everybody as we kind of move through. So in the description of this webinar, there were some kind of 4 big pieces, and I'll just kind of hit upon them now to give you an idea of where we're going and some of the topic areas we're going to hit upon. The first thing is that if you do house zone rescaling, pricing analysis, and you're doing it manually, you probably have realized it's quite a tedious and time-consuming and error-prone kind of process. It's a difficult thing to do, but I will say that that's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm a huge fan of tedious and time-consuming sometimes, because it's when we slow things down, we really start to understand what's going on. Sometimes fast is not better. So that tedious and time-consuming part is just a reality, not necessarily a judgment on whether it's good or bad. It can be either. The second thing is that I think you want to make this idea of zone and pricing analysis just part of something that you do all the time. It is something you should be looking at regularly and kind of analyzing in small ways, and we'll talk about what that looks like. What are you looking for when you're looking at things every week? Third, I think you want to look, and if you come away with anything out of all of this, and maybe in the last year or two, really post-pandemic, I've come away with this idea that we need to look at all of this through the lens of customer value and what customers value, because I think that's maybe the most important lesson that all of this analysis can give us, is seeing your sales and your strategy through the lens of the customer. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then finally, I think good decisions come from a good process. So sometimes you can make a good decision and not get the result you intended. It was still a good decision. And so zone and pricing analysis, scaling a hall, is about a bunch of decisions. And so you need to have a process in place. And a good process, really underlying a good process, is a set of principles. And so we're going to talk about what does that process look like, what are some of those principles, and hopefully whether you are an organization that does 100 or 200 performances a year, or you're doing 15 or 20 performances a year, and we work with that entire range, these are ideas that will translate all the way through. So let's kind of start with why this whole idea of rescaling, and there's a lot of terminology here, but I'm going to kind of repeat it all together every time just so there's no mistaking what we're talking about. But rescaling, repricing, rezoning, like that whole world of that analysis, why is it important? The primary goal here is alignment of supply, demand, and pricing. That's what you're trying to do. You're not trying to make promises of potential revenue increases or potential shift in demand. Alignment. You're just really after alignment there. And we'll talk in a little bit about what that actually looks like visibly when you look at your data. Pricing and zones are two different decisions. So I think this is an important piece, if you've not done this before, that the zone is a block of seats and the price you put into it and put on that zone is a different issue. So different performances can have the same zones and different prices. And they can start off differently, they can end up differently, but those are two separate decisions and should be kept that way. And again, this analysis starts to surface what that looks like. And finally, why is this important? Market intelligence. You need to know what's going on in your market. And this kind of analysis, whether you do anything substantial with it or not, becomes a really important source of intelligence. From the principle side, what are kind of some of the underlying principles here? Supply and strength of program. So supply is obviously important here. Demand, competition for event demand. Really what you're competing for are people's time and money. That's what the competition is here, is are your events compelling enough, both from a programmatic standpoint and a pricing standpoint, to compete for people's time and money? There is a substitution that goes on here. So pricing is both relative and absolute, meaning that people have to be able to afford the actual amount you're asking them to pay, but then they're going to make these substitution trade-offs inside your hall and say, well, that seat is worth $50, but that one's not worth $45. So they're going to make these trade-offs, zone, location, and prices. Location matters when it comes to this. In terms of identifying the trends and what that looks like from a an ongoing standpoint, what does optimal look like? You need to know what an optimal trend, an optimal distribution pattern in your hall looks like. Where should people want to sit and when should they want to sit there? How does that hall fill up? So you need to know what optimal looks like. You want to look at your patterns regularly. So I think while pricing and scaling analysis can be looked at as a once every few years process, the idea of understanding your trends is something you want to be looking at on a regular basis. And finally, I think your obligation is actually to the customer. So in this analysis, typically what happens is this analysis is something that is maybe a little bit top down in terms of the mandate to do the analysis. But again, the lens through which you want to do this analysis is actually from the customer's perspective. And the reason is there are very few advocates for your customer inside your organization. Typically, the president or executive director of your organization is probably has a focus around financial responsibility and artistic integrity. Your CFO is super focused on just the financial health of the business. And marketing and sales, I think, has to be focused on this idea of the tension between those financial requirements and the customer value and the customer experience. And this analysis can start to surface that conversation. But if there's going to be an advocate for value for the customer, it's got to come from the marketing and sales team, because there's nobody else in the organization who's likely to kind of advocate and push those ideas forward. And it really is from customer value comes demand, and from demand comes revenue. So the underlying kind of idea here is that if you want to drive revenue, you've got to drive customer value, and somebody in the organization has to be an advocate for what's going on there. So let's forward here. So let's jump into how do we measure some of this? And I think when we start to get into the metrics of what we're going to use to make some of these decisions, the most important metric out of all of this is revenue per available seat. That is what represents the yield that you get from every seat that you put on sale. And when you measure this, you can make all sorts of decisions just based on this one metric. So let me start by sort of talking first about how we measure revenue per available seat. And I'll probably kind of verbally abbreviate it RevPAS as we go through here. So revenue per available seat, two different ways here that we can measure this, both giving you the same number. You take revenue from a given zone and divide it by the total capacity of that zone. Or you take the average paid ticket price from a zone and multiply it by the percentage paid capacity of that zone. So I'm just going to repeat it just so you can kind of see where we're going here. So revenue per available seat. So kind of the calculation is a little bit in the title there. So you take the total revenue from a zone and divide it by the total capacity of the zone, or take the average paid ticket price from the zone and multiply it by the percentage of paid capacity of that zone. Both will give you the exact same number, but one might resonate with you a little bit more. You might be easier to explain to people what's going on with one of those particular calculations. Now, why is this metric important? It's very different from another metric that it can get confused with because they're both denominated in dollars and dollars per seat. But revenue per available seat is very different from average paid ticket price, because average paid ticket price doesn't actually account for supply or it really for demand either. It is really just telling you of the people who did purchase, how much on average did they pay? So oftentimes you see that metric related to an entire event or a genre of event, or even with a given zone. The problem with average ticket price is it requires much more context in order to interpret. You cannot take average paid ticket price and make any judgment about whether sales are going well or not going well, whether you should raise prices or lower prices or do nothing. On its own, average paid ticket price is an interesting metric, but it's not terribly actionable. And one quick illustration is that you could sell one ticket at full price in a certain zone and have a very high average paid ticket price. But if you think about it, you have a very low paid capacity in that zone. So if you were keying your decisions off of average paid ticket price, then you may be inclined to move ticket prices up there because one person paid full price. But if you look at it from the perspective of revenue per available seat, then you'll see that you actually have very little revenue generated in that zone per available seat, since most of that zone is actually empty. And so this kind of highlights why revenue per available seat on a zone level is really a critical metric when it comes to making decisions and taking action on pricing or on rezoning, either way, one of the two. Revenue per available seat allows you to compare different zones of different sizes and different prices. And you can't do that with average paid ticket price because very likely your average paid ticket price is highest in the zones that started with the highest price and are lowest in the zones that started with the lowest price. That's not always the case with with RevPass. With revenue per available seat, oftentimes you see zones that are lower priced, generate higher levels of revenue per available seat than zones that have a higher price, because the demand just isn't there for that particular higher price zone. And so when you see that, that starts to put a spotlight on potential problems in the pricing strategy, potential changes that you might want to make to the zone and the scale. And so revenue per available seat can surface that for you, whereas average paid ticket price can't. Average paid ticket price, sometimes higher is better, sometimes lower is better. The natural curve of average paid ticket price is to go down over time. And this is counter to what many people who don't live in the marketing and sales world in performing arts organizations, that's counter to what they might think. If all things being equal, a performance that sells a lot of tickets will probably have a lower average paid ticket price than a performance that sells fewer tickets, because the performance that sold fewer tickets probably sold a small number of high price seats rather than a large number of seats distributed across a range of prices, which would naturally drive down average paid ticket price. So average paid ticket price becomes a bit of a trap when it comes to making these sorts of decisions. It's a number that appears on every sales report that I've ever seen, and it's a number that you can't do a lot with unless you really unpack things a little bit more. So if we want to come back to that a little bit later, please throw a question out, and we can certainly tackle questions around this metric. It's an incredibly important concept, and I'm going to unpack for you how we can use this to identify problems in pricing and scaling. So I'm going to give you an example of what you do with this. So the first step would be to taking the revenue that you have and organizing it by zone here. So along here, I've got examples of zones from a particular venue. And if you calculate the total revenue divided by the total number of seats in each zone that you have for your venue and venues, you can get a chart something like this, where you've got the zones and you've got the revenue per available seat for each zone in a particular venue. Now, realize you can subdivide this. If you do different genres of performances, if you're a ballet company and you've got Nutcracker and a rep season, probably want to separate those two out. A symphony season might have pops and classicals. Do this separately for both of those, perhaps by day of week. So any segmented bucket of performances, you can do this, where you've got your zones and then you calculate total revenue for that zone divided by the total number of seats available. The easiest place to start with that denominator of total number of seats is just the gross capacity of that zone, and you can probably grab that from your ticketing system as well. So when you graph this out, you get all these different numbers here. And so the idea now is that what we want to do is we want to anchor our analysis around one particular zone. I call it an anchor zone. It's a zone that is performing very well. It's a zone that you're unlikely to feel pressure to lower prices on. It's a zone that generates a high percentage of its gross potential revenue. So it's probably has a very stable level of demand. So in this particular case, I choose this zone here marked with number 1, this Orchestra A zone. What you want to do to get a sense of what revenue per available seat can do for you is to create a series of ratios, which all that means is taking the revenue per available seat of each zone and compare it to our anchor zone. I've given you an example of that right here. So you take Orc B is generating $75 in revenue per available seat. Orchestra A is generating 85, so the ratio is 0.88. Orchestra B is generating 88% of the revenue per available seat that Orchestra A is generating. Now, why is this relevant? So let's think about it. You put a bunch of seats on sale, and then you price the seats. What this is telling you is what the market thinks of your pricing strategy. It is giving you some feedback on the location of the zone, the price that you put on it, and how much it's really worth in the market. And so you can see here that this orchestra B zone is worth about, the market is telling us, it's worth about 88% of what orchestra A is. The asset in that orchestra B zone, those seats, are generating about 88% of the revenue per available seat as orchestra A. There's an argument to be made that orchestra B should be priced about 88% of orchestra A. If it's yielding 88%, then I think the pricing should be somewhere around that range. There may be other reasons why you don't want to do that, but it's worth the discussion, which is why I say it's worth, there's an argument to be made that that's how it should be done. And you can see orchestra C is generating 68 divided by 85, approximately 2/3 of the revenue per available seat of orchestra A. So orchestra C should be priced in proportion to what it's generating in terms of revenue per available seat. And if you go down the line here, you get a very interesting analysis. You get an estimate of what the price should be, the ratio of the actual price to the anchor zone for each of these zones. Now, obviously in some of these zones, for a number of reasons, won't kind of get into it here, we're not generating a lot of revenue here, so you know the ratios here probably won't be too useful. But for some of these other zones, you're going to get a very useful set of ratios. And because it's a very difficult decision, you know, if you price orchestra A at $100, what should orchestra B be priced at? It's a difficult decision unless you have this information where, hey, orchestra B is generating about 88, or let's call it 90% of the rev pass of orchestra A. Maybe if orchestra A is $100 a ticket, orchestra B should be about $90 a ticket. And now you're pricing the zones in proportion to what the market is telling you they're worth relative to each other. In this particular case, orchestra A, B, and C are all actually initially priced at the same price. So there's an argument to be made that maybe we need to lower some of this or carve out some of the unproductive seats and put them into a different zone. But this kind of analysis allows you to compare different zones, zones of different prices and different capacities, and do it in a way that yields you something really important, which is this relative value of one zone over another. Now, another way to look at this. So we looked at all of that previous data just by zone, right? Every block was just an individual zone. Another interesting way to look at it is to look at it on a seat level, which is what this heat map in front of you is showing. This is a heat map generated from our internal tools, but later on, before we finish up, I'm going to show you how to do this in Excel. Everything that we've done at Analytics that is now more or less automated and on the web, we did first in Excel. And so I think it's, and this comes back to the tedious and time-consuming point that I made earlier, that if you can do it manually, you gain a really great appreciation of what the analysis is going to show you, because it does slow down the process a little bit and forces you to really take a look at the data. So in this particular heat map, what you're seeing is demand mapped on a seat-by-seat basis, as opposed to a zone-by-zone basis, which is what we had before. And so you see different patterns here. In an interest of time, I'm going to jump and kind of highlight what this kind of visual analysis can show you that some of the more abstract column charts, bar charts by zone may not be able to show you. So what you see here is a heat map of the venue. Dark green represents higher concentrations of demand, and then it goes through a gradient of colors: dark green, light green, yellow, orange, red. Red represents some of the low levels of paid demand. Overlaid on top of here are the price zones. So price level 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. I've laid those numbers over there so you can kind of see and get a sense of the relative initial pricing that is set here. And so what I want to draw your attention to is what we can see right up here in this area. I'm trying to highlight it with my cursor here, is you've got a zone that's priced at price level 6, but you can see the back half of the zone is nearly empty in terms of demand. And then you can see all this demand jumping up into price level 7. You may have experienced this in your hall too. It's a super common pattern. And one of those things that is the most common reason to reprice a hall or rescale a hall is when you see people jumping over half a section here to get to a lower price. And this is the kind of pattern that doesn't show up in this chart. In this chart, we see everything in very abstract terms. Here we get things into very tangible terms, and probably something that if you were in the venue in a performance, you would see this. This is what you're going to see when you get there. You also see a couple of other things. You see a lot of demand concentrated down the middle of the venue with less demand out to the side zones. So something that also jumps out at you. If you are analyzing this by zone, you may see that depending on how your zones are, but this obviously jumps out very easily to you when you look at it as a heat map. Here in this next slide here, I put the zone breaks, and you can see the very horizontal kind of east-west kind of breaks in the zones as you go across here. And so this makes it a little bit more clear that, hey, there's a price break right there, and people are jumping over the last third of this zone and going back to the lower price there. And the other thing I want to point out here is the arcing pattern of the natural kind of buying pattern of people. This is not unique to this venue. This is the buying pattern that exists in every venue. People naturally make a choice of closer up and off to the side, further back and in the center. You can see that arc exists there. You can see the arc right there. You can see the arc there and there. Every section here, you can see that natural buying arc. Further back and in the center, closer up and off to the side within every price level that we have here. And like I said, that exists in every venue. What gets in the way of the natural buying pattern are prices and zones. So when the prices and zones aren't aligned correctly with how people want to make decisions and trade-offs between price and location, you get that. You get people jumping over that and telling you what they want, and they jump back there. It's not that price level 6 was too expensive. It's that those seats in price level 6 were simply not worth price level 6 anymore, and they jumped back to price level 7. That exists again in every hall. This is a very simple example of a very common issue and something that can be surfaced by looking at the data on a seat by seat basis. You can start to surface what's happening here. What you're after is understanding where those natural arcing patterns exist in your venue, because it'll be different for every venue. Where do they exist in your venue? And then how do you construct the zones and the prices in a way that doesn't interfere with how people want to buy? That's the alignment question. That's what you're driving here towards. Now you can also, the previous one we were looking at paid capacity heat mapped. In this particular case, we're looking at revenue heat mapped. And so you can see darker green represents higher concentrations of revenue, goes to light green, yellow, orange, red. And so you can see the natural gradient pattern here. And you can see kind of the natural way that the market will work itself out to show you how the seats are valued. Seats, as we said before, that are generating similar levels of revenue per available seat, an argument can be made that they should be priced the same. This map, if this map back here highlights the problems potentially with your current pricing strategy, revenue per available seat mapping allows you to see what the solution might look like. And it may not be a solution that you can jump to right away. It may take a season or two to get there, but you can start to see there are our current zones, and here are those arcs again. And you can see that same set of arcs now mirroring the revenue that exists, not just the demand, but the revenue. That's where it is. And so you can see That's kind of what you want to drive for. You're trying to shape your zones and your pricing in a way that mirrors how people are buying tickets. Like I said, this might be the ideal, and it may not be a place you can get to right away, but knowing the patterns and identifying and understanding the market allows you to then make changes over time. So what do you do with all of this? So a few things to jump through here. You could lower prices for overpriced zones. You could reduce the supply of tickets for overpriced zones. That's what we were looking at that back half of that zone 6. Those tickets were clearly overpriced for the value the market was willing to place on them. You could raise ticket prices for underpriced zones, or you could simply increase the supply of tickets for underpriced zones. Either way, and I don't think there's a right way to go about doing this. Much of this depends upon your objectives, your subscriber base or lack of subscriber base for just special performances, a lot of other considerations in terms of what you want to do. But those are the 4 basic outcomes of looking at this analysis in terms of demand and revenue distribution, in terms of what you can do and what steps you can take to rezone. So if you go through that analysis, these are kind of your 4 options that you're left with. A key consideration here is volume of subscription tickets. Generally, what you're going to see is performances that have a high volume of subscription tickets will have much better revenue per available seat, higher capacity, and probably fewer problems that you can identify when you do the analysis. In this particular case, one of the changes that we made here, and what I've done here is up above the top map here kind of illustrates the distribution of price points and zones as they stand or as they stood previously. And what we did is we actually just lowered the bar. So we pushed this zone break down several rows, essentially creating and acknowledging that what the market was valuing in those seats was valuing them at a price level 7 and not a 6. We took all of these price level 3, 4, 5 seats, and you can see we translated them into price level 6. So we repriced an area of the venue that was not generating much revenue or demand at its current price and simply repriced them down. And then repriced the outer zones as 7. So now you can see what we've got here. Here is our arc. You've got our arc for price level 6, and you've got an arc for price level 7. We're starting to realign the pricing in the shape of the natural demand patterns and doing it in a way that preserves the existing revenue but opens up opportunities to drive volume for kind of in future years. I'm going to move quickly through a couple of things here. Revenue growth, where does it come from? Because that's ultimately what everybody's after here is revenue growth. Volume. Revenue growth over the long run comes from volume growth. And the most efficient driver of volume is frequency. How often can you get people to come? Either multiple single ticket buyers or subscribers. Frequency is the key to revenue, to volume growth. And the key to stimulating frequency is providing value. And so it's difficult to convince customers of value when you have empty seats or do a lot of discounting. So when we go back here, one of the reasons to move these prices down was to improve the volume in those very visible seats, thereby allowing us to discount less and improve the perceived value to the customer. So starting at the bottom, it's about driving value to the customer, which is why it's important for you to be an advocate. There has to be an advocate for customer value because ultimately that's what's going to get you to revenue growth. Now, from the heat mapping standpoint, like I said, everything that I showed you there on those heat maps was driven by the tools that we've built, but everything that we built was built off of Excel initially. So it is possible to do all of this in Microsoft Excel. I went back and looked at a file from 2009, and this was a venue, a client that we worked with then, we still work with now, and a heat map of their venue. And you can see all of this was done in Excel. And basically what you're doing, for those of you who are familiar with Excel, you create a shape of the venue, which I know a lot of people have anyway, just to visualize the pricing and the zones. But then you link each one of those cells to a data point in a table that has all the metrics that you want to map, whether it's average ticket price or percent page capacity or revenue per available seat or percentage of gross potential. You link that using a VLOOKUP statement to a table of data that you can then just toggle through and remap multiple metrics. So in this particular workbook, this is just a screenshot of it, but I had 6 different maps and I could just toggle through each one of them, filtering each one for certain performances. So it is, it's something you absolutely can do in Excel. And as you can see, visualizing all of this on a seat level basis gives you a different appreciation for what the patterns actually are and for the more surgical changes you can make in them. So finally, just in real life, does it work? It does work. We work with a symphony orchestra who over a couple of years simplified and reduced prices across their venue, started with almost a promise to their customers that the prices they were going to get at the beginning of the year were going to be the lowest and everything was only going to move up. And then they watched very carefully, spent a lot of time, and were very diligent about watching demand and dynamically pricing tickets over the course of the season. And at the end of FY24, resulted in near record levels of tickets and revenue. It was an incredible success, took time. I'm sure it was tedious, but all of it driven by data, all of it driven by the natural observation of the natural buying patterns that exist in the data. So if you follow the data and advocate for the customer here and advocate for customer value, there's a lot of upside that can be driven over time. And I think if you're kind of governed by a longer term view of all of this, the decisions actually become quite easy when you're focused on the customer. So I'm gonna kind of pause right there and see if there are any questions in any areas we want to kind of go back to. John, if there are some questions, happy to jump into that right now.
Okay, thank you. Type those questions into the question box, send them in, anything goes. So if you've got a particular question about your venue, now is the time to ask Anil. All right, here we go. If we identify several changes we want to make, should we make the changes all at once?
So my preference on making changes, I kind of look at everything on a 2-year cycle. I think when you do this analysis, or you do any kind of analysis, or you're really just even going off of just your observations, my guess is that there are changes you want to make that are obvious and kind of low-hanging fruit. They're likely to have the biggest impact on the customer experience, the sales experience, the demand distribution in the venue. So if you've got a long list of changes, I would stick to a small number of low risk, high impact changes in the first year, because here's what's going to happen is when you change the configuration of your zones or your pricing strategy, you're going to find that it changes the demand patterns, which is exactly what you want. You want change to occur, but sometimes you don't always know exactly how that's going to play out for you. So making a small number of obvious low-risk changes starts to change the rules of the game for your customers, and you start to see how that plays out. And whether your theories on how the changes in scaling and pricing were going to impact demand, you get to see whether that played out as you expected or whether there were some unexpected outcomes that came from it. So I would stick to a small number of changes in year 1, see and observe how it plays out, and then follow up with a set of changes in a second year. And usually over a 2-season cycle, you can cover most of what you want to do. I think the second reason to split it up is that it's difficult to measure the impact of 7 changes in 1 year. You'll see, likely if you make a bunch of changes, you're going to see, a bunch of pricing and scaling changes, you're going to see some changes to the demand and the distribution of tickets and where people buy. But what you really also kind of secondarily want is to be able to understand what of your changes had the most impact. And if you make 7 or 8 big changes, it's difficult to figure out the cause and effect there. So if you make a small number of related changes and very targeted changes, you can start to understand the impact, kind of the ROI, the return that you get on that investment of time and effort in making those changes.
All right. We currently price the whole venue as adult and senior tickets. The pairs of seats on both sides of the aisle are the most popular. We are considering changing those seats to a higher priced zone. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's very common, increasingly so, I think. I've seen more aisles, people jumping just up and down the aisles with demand than I think I've seen before. So I would say it's weighing off this question, which is the added complexity of putting those zones or those seats potentially into their own zone weighed off by the potential revenue that you might get from those additional seats. So I think there are oftentimes two ways to do that. You may have an existing zone that you can move those aisle seats into that existing zone, in which case you're not adding any additional zones, you're just adding supply to an existing zone, kind of one of the outcomes, one of the potential decisions that I highlighted earlier. So if that's the case, that would be very simple. I'd definitely go with that. If you feel like you're going to, because of how the hall is configured, that you're going to have to create a new zone just for aisles, I think that's where the complexity question comes in. Because with every zone you add, you create another decision point for somebody, because now somebody looking at it is going to have to weigh off the value of an aisle seat to the increased price versus the value of a middle of the main floor seat at a lower price. It's a more complex decision. And so the question is, how much more complex is it, and is it worth that? I guess a third consideration is how much more you're going to make those seats. So I think it really is a question of complexity, and are you adding more complexity than is necessary? But in general, if you can drop those seats into an existing zone, I would go for it.
Okay, let's keep those cards and letters coming in, folks. Here's another question for you. Do you divide sections in the middle of a row, or keep one full row in a section? For example, if someone wants to buy 2 seats next to each other, what's the risk of having one seat in one zone price and the partner's seat in another?
My guess, the way to reduce the probability of that happening is to make sure you draw the line at an even number of seats. That would definitely reduce the probability of that happening as you kind of go north-south with the break in the middle of a row. We have breaks in, so some of the consideration is how the hall is configured. Do you have a hall that has natural aisles going north, south, and east, west? Do you have natural architectural breaks in the venue? It's always easier to work your way through what's there architecturally in the venue. But assuming that that's not the case, and you really do want to make a break, or the data is leading you to needing to make a break in the middle of a block of seats, then I would err on the side of probably having slightly more seats in that zone to avoid the possibility of having to deal with one seat being priced higher versus lower, and then count it out based on an even number of seats to, again, reduce the probability. But I wonder, and others certainly better qualified to answer this question, whether that's actually a problem in the purchase path of the ticket, whether that creates a problem. And I guess that may be the root of the question, that you may not be able to actually buy the ticket in that way. So if that's the case, that may be a separate question. But we have plenty of cases where we've got rows broken in some way simply because the hall is configured such that we don't have a choice. We either have a lot of empty seats in, you know, the lower demand part of the row, or we break the row, risk the, you know, the multiple price point purchase in a given order versus not being able to correctly price a large quantity of seats. So I wouldn't hesitate to do it if that's where the data is leading you, and then see what the outcome is there. But I think it's important to think through the execution piece. So I think that's a good thought. But I wouldn't. You don't want to leave half a row unsold consistently because you're trying to avoid not selling 2 seats in the middle of the main floor, right? That's not a good trade-off to make.
All right. Any reflections or advice on how this approach that you've explained interacts with other pricing considerations such as young audience pricing or supported tickets pricing? In other words, discounted tickets for those who need a break.
Yep.
Is this something we can account for in RevPass?
Yeah, what a great question. So I think I think what this approach will naturally do is it will reduce your reliance on purely promotional discounting, the kind of discounting you do when you have much lower than expected demand or just low demand for an event, and you need to go out and discount the tickets and do the Travel Zoo offers and the Gold Star offers and all of those sorts of broad third-party discounts or even internal discounts. So this approach is meant to reduce your dependence on that kind of discounting, as opposed to more constituency-based discount, which is, oh, we've got students and we want to cultivate our relationship with students, so we offer them a discount, or senior discounts, or military discounts. It's not intended to supplant that kind of discounting. I think all of that discounting can still find its way in here. And I would say that in general, and every organization is different, but that constituency-based discounting is probably not enough to move the needle and would be easily absorbed if you were selling more full price tickets. So if you think about what we're trying to accomplish here, we're trying to sell more full price tickets and reduce the reliance on promotional discounting. So if you're selling more full price tickets, you kind of have a little bit more margin to give to those other constituencies that you want to support. So I think it absolutely can work. I would say none of our clients, we've done some form of rescaling with everybody, and there hasn't been a case where people have felt like they have to give up supporting a certain constituency because of the rescaling that we did. There may be other considerations, such as targeting more inventory to certain constituencies in certain events and maybe less in other events. That may be a case. But I would not have a worry, nor should you have an expectation that constituency supported kind of constituency discounts would go away or be impacted. It's really the promotional discounting that we want to reduce.
Great. Okay. More questions. Keep them coming. This is your chance to ask your specific question. How do you analyze the financial impact of these changes?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's a question that will no doubt get asked when you jump into this kind of analysis. If you remember, one of the principles early on that I described was you're trying to go after alignment here, because aligning supply, demand, and price will naturally unlock the value of your marketing strategies in a way that might be impeded right now if the zones and the prices aren't in their right position in the hall. And so the financial impact, when you look at that, it's very difficult to predict what might happen over the next couple of years exactly in terms of what single ticket buyers might do. But the financial impact you want to avoid is the financial impact to your subscribers. So if you're talking about rescaling performances that have and are on a subscription season, the place to go is to look at what impact this might have as you redraw the lines of the zones on subscribers. And I think the first idea here is you don't want to have any impact, if possible, on 95% or more of your subscribers. You want, if there's a choice of where to draw the lines of zones, it's around where the subscribers are sitting right now. That is the one sure base of buyers you can go back to next year and ask them to come back. Single ticket buyers come and go as individual households. But subscriber households, most of them stick around in very large quantities from one year to the next. So that is the base that I think you want to feel an obligation to minimizing the volatility to where, what the price might be for their tickets. And so when I think of financial impact, I do push back hard on this one and say, what the financial impact we want to avoid is on subscribers. The rest of it, this is what I've seen over 20 years. When you align these zones more effectively with the natural buying patterns, you will sell more tickets. It will just unlock demand. It's difficult to tell exactly how much because it's dependent on programming and strategy, but the best chance you have to maximizing demand is reconfiguring the alignment of the zones and the prices. So the financial impact, I would say, really examine it on a subscriber level, and it can certainly be analyzed on a single ticket level, but I think it's less relevant because of the volatility from one year to the next with the single ticket households.
Great. Okay, I think we have time for one more question unless somebody types one in real quick. So here we go. Who should ideally be involved in making final decisions on rescaling a hall?
I think this has to be collaborative, and I think you should include all the people who would be involved, anybody kind of responsible on the revenue side or on the execution side. So you've got ticketing people, marketing, you've got sales, and I think you want to start that collaboration as early as possible, primarily starting with identifying what the problem areas are. So what I have found is that when you show those maps and you start talking about this, there's generally a lot of consensus around what some of the obvious problems are. Certain areas that don't sell consistently, certain areas that should be selling better that aren't selling. Those are areas that you can kind of come around on, and if you can put data or maps on that those points, you can start to get some collaboration around what the key problems are we're trying to solve. And this is another reason why not trying to solve 8 different problems is helpful. If you pick 1 or 2 problems, it's easy to collaborate and get some buy-in around those, because it's one thing to analyze and identify the problems. It's a second step to actually execute the solution. And because you need the solution to be executed well, whether it's physically redesigning the hall in the ticketing system, or it's communicating with subscribers and ticket buyers about the changes they're going to encounter the following season, that all needs to be coordinated. There are always unintended consequences. And so spending both time and resource internally between the key stakeholders across marketing, sales, and ticketing, that becomes critical. Execution, I'd much rather execute a strategy well than think I've got the perfect strategy that kind of gets botched on the execution side. So execution is super important.
Okay, I think that just about does it. Brings us to the end of our hour. We'll get the recording of this webinar and slides out tomorrow to our members. If you're not a member, you can become one by going to artsreach.com. We have these kinds of webinars about every 2 weeks or so. So thank you, Anil, and we'll see everybody next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone.